Sand pushed into a shape in open water does not hold that shape on its own. But 2.5 miles off Dubai, 300 islands of dredged sand have held their shape for 18 years, and the men who built them were paid billions of dirhams to make it happen. Start with how the work was done. A dredger cuts wet sand off the seabed. A steel pipe carries that sand out over deep water. The sand piles up until it breaks the surface. You can hear the pipe before you see it. The salt spray dries white on every machine near it, and the dust off the dry stockpiles gets into everything. Then the sand gets shaped by hand and by machine. Then one long wall of rock goes in outside all of it. At first, this might just seem like a very large sandcastle with a very large budget. The project is called the World, and Nakheel built it. 300 islands laid out as a map of the Earth, in a rough oval about 5 miles across. You could sail across the whole thing in an afternoon. The reclamation cost at the World has been reported at around 7.2 billion dirhams, close to $2 billion. Somebody signed for that. The men who moved the sand were paid out of it. Reclamation is the industry word for land made by pouring sand into the sea until it stands above the water. So here are 2 questions about the World. What is actually holding those islands of Nakheel sand in place today? And why, after 18 years and $2 billion, can nobody on either side of the argument produce a single measurement? You have stood on a wet beach somewhere and felt the sand pull out from under your heels as a wave went back. That is the same force at a much larger size. Here is what went into the World, and the numbers are worth hearing slowly. Around 320 million cubic meters of dredged sand, around 34 million tons of rock, and a wall of that rock running roughly 15 miles around the outside of everything. Engineers call that outer wall a breakwater. In plain terms, a breakwater is a wall built out in the water, so that waves break on it instead of on the thing behind it. Now hold on to one detail about the breakwater at the World, because the whole video turns on it. Almost all of that rock sits in the outer wall. The nearest island sits at least 1,300 feet inside it. Between the wall and the islands there is open water. Between the islands there is more open water, and the channels there run about 300 feet across. Nakheel has said the breakwater has 6 openings in it, for boats and for water to move through, so the protection is one wall with 6 gaps, standing well back, and 300 shaped sandbanks sitting inside it. To understand the World, you have to stop looking at the map shape and start looking at that gap of open water. Here is the comparison that makes it clear. Compare the World with Palm Jumeirah, because Nakheel built both. Palm Jumeirah is wrapped by a curved breakwater that hugs the fronds closely. Engineers designed that curve for a storm wave of about 13 feet. The rock armor on its outer face runs up to 6 tons a stone. The wall and the land it protects are almost touching each other. The World does not work that way. One wall, far out, with 6 gaps in it. Everything inside is left to whatever water gets through. What follows is that system taken apart, one piece at a time. This channel exists to take apart systems like this one, so if that is what you came for, subscribe and stay with it. Now, that is a design choice and not a defect. Waves lose energy when they break on the outer wall, so the water inside is calmer than the open gulf. But calmer is not still. Sand moves in calm water too, and somebody has to pay to put it back. Now the rate at which it went in. Peter van Gelderen worked as a project engineer at Van Oord, the Dutch dredging contractor that built the World. Dredging, in plain terms, means cutting sand off the seabed and pumping it where you want it. The scale of what those crews did is easier to feel as a rate than as a total. Sand went down at about 3 million cubic meters a week. Rock went in at an average of 200,000 tons a week, and that average held for 3 years. Here is what that rate looks like from the deck. Picture the deck of a Van Oord rock barge off Dubai in July. A worker in boots and gloves stands beside a crane while the stone comes off the barge and goes over the side. His hands are wet. The salt has already dried white on the steel and on the cable, and it gets into the grease on every moving part. After each pass, a Van Oord surveyor drops a gauge over the side and checks the profile of the wall in the water below him. A breakwater, built a few feet low in one place, is a breakwater with a door in it, and nobody finds that door until a storm does. The men on that barge in Dubai are not building anything anybody will ever photograph. The wall they are placing will spend its whole life underwater or just above it, out of sight of every island it protects. They are paid by the ton and by the week, and the schedule is the thing everybody on the boat argues about. Van Oord has described one continuous section of that breakwater as the longest ever built. On a job like this, the crews swap out, the barges keep running, and the water inside the ring changes month by month as the wall closes up. Then, in September 2008, the money stopped. Dubai property prices fell by more than half from their peak. Work on the world stopped with them, and the barges went home. The crews were paid off. By January 2009, around 175 islands had been sold, at prices reported between $20 million and $50 million each. Buyers had sand. Buyers did not have roads, power, or fresh water. Now the argument. Because this is where the public record gets strange. But first, the company that ran the boats. Penguin Marine held the marine transport rights to the world. Penguin ran the boats out there. In 2010 and 2011, Penguin Marine and Nakheel ended up in front of a tribunal in Dubai. Both sides brought lawyers. Neither brought a survey. The tribunal had been set up to handle Dubai world disputes. Lawyers filled the room. British judges sat on it. Two of them were Sir Anthony Evans and Sir John Chadwick. Not one surveyor appears anywhere in the papers. Penguin Marine argued that the project had effectively stopped. If the project had stopped, Penguin said, the service contract it had signed should fall away. Penguin was paying Nakheel a license fee reported at 5 million dirhams a year. Capt. Alex Labour was the general manager. Capt. Pedro Cagalan was the chief operating officer. Both were running a ferry service to islands with almost nobody on them. Their boats burned fuel that somebody had to pay for. Then the barrister said the sentence that went around the world. Richard Wilmot Smith was the Queen's counsel acting for Penguin Marine. Wilmot Smith told the tribunal that the islands are gradually falling back into the sea. He raised erosion and deterioration of the islands as well. He also said the navigation channels between them were silting up, which means filling with sediment until a boat can no longer pass. That one line ran in newspapers across Europe, and it is still the line most people repeat about the world. Set it aside for one moment, because within days, Nakheel gave you an answer. Here is the answer Nakheel gave. Chris O'Donnell was the chief executive of Nakheel at the time. O'Donnell spoke on the 27th of January in 2011. He told reporters in Dubai that the world is definitely not sinking, it is not washing away, and it is not eroding. You can still read the quote. Nakheel went further in a separate statement the same week. You can read both statements today, 15 years later, and they still contradict each other. The company said its periodical monitoring survey over the past 3 years had not shown any substantial erosion requiring sand nourishment. That means pumping or trucking new sand back onto a beach that has lost some. So that is both sides on the record. Read those two statements next to each other and you have the whole problem. One side says the islands are falling into the sea. The other side says 3 years of survey work found nothing that needed a load of sand. Neither side published a number. Now the part I could not close. I went looking for one. I looked for the survey Nakheel referred to. I looked for a number from Penguin Marine. I looked for a study measuring erosion at the world in feet or in cubic meters. I could not find any of it. If a published measurement exists and you know where it is, put the link in the comments and I will pin it. The missing number is not a small gap. The sand and rock alone cost close to $2 billion, and the only two parties with a reason to measure the result were a developer and a contractor suing that developer. A third pair of hands looked at the world, and that one needs handling carefully. The Emirates Institute for Advanced Science and Technology is a Dubai government body. The institute used images from the Dubai-Sat satellite covering November 2009 to January 2011. Two research engineers, Amar Saif Al-Muhairi and Abdullah Hamad Boushahab, reported the result. The two engineers said all signs indicated the islands were safe, with no sign of erosion or deterioration. They also said the changes in sediment levels were caused by changing water currents, and that they had not noticed any trend that could be called alarming. Now the caveat, and it matters. The Institute is a Dubai government body, and Nakheel is a state-backed developer. Nothing about that makes the finding wrong. What it does mean is that no outside hand has been on the gauge at the world. No numbers came out with what Nakheel said. Now the one hard number anybody has, and it needs holding carefully. One measurement of this kind does exist in Dubai, and it belongs to a different island. You have to be careful with it. The survey company Fugro used satellite data over Dubai and reported that Palm Jumeirah was settling at about 5 millimeters a year. Adam Thomas, a project manager at Fugro, said the ground at Palm Jumeirah was moving downwards at a number of locations across the island. Engineers call that subsidence. That means the ground is going down under your feet. Hold that number at arm's length. Keep a hand on it. 5 millimeters a year is a Palm Jumeirah figure. Palm Jumeirah is not the world. Different wall, different water, different sand. Anybody quoting the Fugro number while talking about the world has moved a measurement from one project onto another, and that is exactly the move this video is trying not to make. Fugro measured the wrong island. So who paid at the world, while nobody measured? The Dubai World Tribunal ruled, and it ruled on the contract rather than on the sand. The judges found that the evidence did not establish that progress had altogether stopped. Penguin Marine lost. In December 2012, Penguin was ordered to pay 10 million dirhams. Capped Labor's company had told the tribunal it had already spent more than 20 million dirhams building a harbor and running the operation. Notice what the tribunal was never asked to decide. Nobody put a surveyor in the witness box. Nobody produced a chart of the shoreline. The question of whether the islands were eroding walked into that courtroom as an argument about a contract, and it walked out the same way. Now the physical mechanisms, because they are real, whatever the judges decided. Now the water itself. Water inside a partly closed ring of wall moves sand around. Waves bend as they pass through the 6 gaps in the breakwater and arrive at different islands from different directions. Sand that leaves one bank has to land somewhere, and where it lands is often the water between 2 islands, right where a boat needs the depth. Nakheel has admitted 2 things in public that fit what the water at the world does. Undeveloped islands can change shape slightly, and the fix is a machine that reshapes the slope, and beach maintenance out there is ongoing. Read that second Nakheel line carefully. Sand put back on a beach every year is a bill somebody pays, and no number for it has ever been published. Somebody at Nakheel signs that bill every year. Now the second mechanism, and it has nothing to do with waves. Dredged sand consolidates. Water squeezes out from between the grains over years, and the surface comes down on its own. On other Dubai reclamations, engineers run a machine that vibrates the sand to force that settlement to happen early. Imad Sharif, a geotechnical engineer working in Dubai, has reported that measured settlement is often less than half the theoretical calculation. Eurocode 7, the European standard for geotechnical design, is the document that sets out how an engineer proves ground will hold a load. Vibrating the sand is general Gulf practice. Whether it was applied island by island across the world is not something I could establish. Then there is the storm the Nakheel wall of rock was drawn for. In the Gulf, an extreme storm with an offshore wave height above 11 feet turns up around once a year. Nakheel has said the breakwater at the world was designed for a 1 in 100-year storm. British Standard 6349 is the code that covers maritime works of this kind. A manual from the construction research body Syria, numbered 683, is the reference engineers use for sizing rock armor. Neither document has been publicly tied to this project by anybody. Now the bills that are being paid out there today. Here is who is still spending out there. Josef Kleindienst runs the Kleindienst Group, which is building a cluster called the Heart of Europe on 6 of the islands. Kleindienst has said building out there costs 30 to 50% more than building on the mainland. His group has put the investment at around $6 billion and reported more than 3,000 people working on the site. Now the line that explains the empty islands. Kleindienst also said something that describes the whole archipelago in one line. Most of the other island owners do not want to start, he said, as long as the hubs are not available. Everyone is busy with projects on the mainland, and the islands are not in focus. In October 2024, Josef Kleindienst estimated that the world was still more than 10 years from finished. At that point, he counted 3 completed developments across the whole map. Here is the running cost almost nobody mentions. As of the middle of 2025, there was still no power cable running under the sea from Dubai to the islands of the world. Developers at the world run diesel engines to keep the lights on. You pay for every liter of that fuel twice, once for the fuel and once for the boat. Each island at the world handles its own waste and its own water. A boat from Dubai brings the drums and the tanks. Every liter of fresh water and every drum of fuel arrives by boat. Now the test. Hold on to the wall of rock and the 6 gaps. What follows is a hypothetical engineering stress test. It is not a description or a prediction of an actual event at the world or at any other artificial island. Take one undeveloped island at the world, from the 200 or so with nothing built on them. Nobody lives there. No boat calls. No meter reads anything, because there is no meter. Now stack 4 conditions for you to hold at once. A shamel blows for 3 days and lines up with one of the 6 openings in the breakwater. The rock on the outer wall nearest that opening has settled a few feet since it was placed. Nobody has surveyed that particular island in 2 years, because nobody owns the survey, and the nearest boat crew works for a company that is in a payment dispute. Sand starts to move along one shore, a few feet at a time. No boat from Dubai goes past. Nobody from Nakheel is standing on it to watch, and nobody from Van Oord has been out there in years. So the questions stack up. Who notices first, and how? If a bank loses a few feet of sand, who is required by contract to pay for putting it back? Does the island owner pay for the sand, or does Nakheel? What happens when the owner cannot be found, which is a real condition on a project where islands sold at the top of a market and then went quiet? And with no baseline survey on file, how would anybody prove what that line of sand looked like before? None of those questions is answered by a rock manual. The answers sit in a contract, or they do not exist at all. Now the honest conclusion. The world is not a story about an island sinking. Nothing in the public record establishes that. The one line everybody quotes for it came from a barrister in a contract dispute. The judges who heard him ruled on something else entirely. The world is a story about a number that does not exist. Nobody can look it up, and neither can anybody else who tries. $2 billion of sand and rock went into open water off Dubai, moved there by pipe and by boat. Nakheel says a 3-year survey found nothing. Penguin Marine said the opposite in court, and then lost on a different question. A government institute looked at satellite pictures and published no figures at all. Today, the only settling number anybody can quote for Dubai Reclamation belongs to Palm Jumeirah, a different island with a different wall of rock. That is a strange place for the record to stand. So here is the finding. Not that the world is failing. The finding is that nobody outside those 2 parties has ever been in a position to say either way, and the men who would have to fix it are still paid by whoever picks up the phone. The mechanisms here are general principles of coastal engineering and reclaimed ground. Conditions vary by site. Nothing here asserts that any island is failing. The stress test is hypothetical. Footage is illustrative stock. If you want to understand the hidden systems that keep enormous cities standing, subscribe to the channel. And a question for you. Have you ever seen a shoreline near you change shape after a storm, and did anybody ever come out and measure it? Tell us where, in the comments below.